Hey guys, so today I'll be talking about Unit 3 of AP US History. This is an overview of kind of what happens before the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, and after the American Revolution. So first we have to kind of talk about what leads up to why the Americans are upset with the British. As the Americans were colonies of Britain, there was something called salutary neglect. So that was basically where the Americans were kind of separate from the British. They kind of had their own rules, stuff like that. So they got to experience freedom. So then you had the French and Indian War. And with that, Britain came in, was like, okay, we're getting rid of salutary neglect. And obviously, that did not make the Americans very happy because they were kind of used to ruling on their own. So that's where it kind of all began. Going back to the French and Indian War, this was a war of Britain versus France. They were vying for Native American support. So the British had the Iroquois on their side, and then the French had the Wampanoags. In all, the French lost with the help of the colonists and stuff like that. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763, there's another one, so you have to remember the date, 1763. With that, the French were kicked out of North America. So Canada and east of the Mississippi all went to Britain, and then Louisiana went to Spain, and then Florida also went to Britain. So because of this war, Britain was in tons of debt, and they needed money for this, and some people in Britain blamed the colonists for this debt, which obviously would cause a lot of problems. So the Proclamation Act of 1763 ended the salutary neglect. So Britain began to control the colonies more directly, which obviously caused a problem, as I was saying before, because the colonies kind of got a taste of freedom and they really liked that. Pontiac's Rebellion occurred in 1763 because the British went and decided to expand into the land that they'd gotten from the French after the French and Indian War. And this really antagonized the natives in the northwest area of the Americas. So the Proclamation Line of 1763 was created, which kind of said that you're just not allowed to go past the Appalachian Mountains to prevent more Native American conflicts like this. So because the British were in a lot of debt and they were blaming the Americans, they decided to start just putting in all of these acts and new taxes and laws, and that really pissed off the Americans. The first act that we have is the Sugar Act of 1764. And this is a tax on sugar. It was to like decrease the illegal trade. Then we have the Currency Act of 1764. This said that there was no more paper money because there was a lack of specie, which is like gold, silver, all of that metallic-y goodness, you know. Then we have the Stamp Act, which is one of the worst ones of these. This was of 1765. This was a tax on 50 paper documents. This really upset the colonists because it was passed with no consent of the colonial government, which was a big thing for the colonists. We'll get to that later, though. And the sole purpose of the Stamp Act was to raise money. So the effect of the Stamp Act is the Stamp Act Congress. This met in the same year of the Stamp Act, so 1765. This was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British. James Otis was the creator of this. He wanted this intercolonial Congress so that they could express their problems with the British government. This is the Congress where the phrase "no taxation without representation" was coined. So another revolt kind of thing that came from the Stamp Act was the Sons of Liberty. So this was one of our not most American greatest moments, you know. They would terrorize the stamp collectors, and they would tar and feather them, and tar is really hot, so it was just kind of gross. The Stamp Act was repealed, and in return for that, the Declaratory Act was passed. This stated that Parliament could pass any laws that they wanted. Another act that was passed was the Mutiny/Quartering Act of 1765. This said that the colonists must provide housing and supplies to the British troops. So this was something that really, really bothered the colonists, as it can be seen in the Bill of Rights. And so after the French and Indian War, the colonists were promised that all the British soldiers that they were quartering would be able to leave their houses, but this did not happen. And then this act kind of just like set in stone, no, they're staying, like you don't have a choice. Charles Townshend was the treasurer of the crown's money in Britain. So he kind of ruled because William Pitt, who was the prime minister at the time, he was kind of incapacitated. He was really just not able to do anything. So the Townshend duties were passed in 1767. This was a tax on imports from England, such as lead, paint, paper, and tea. And the Massachusetts Assembly really did not like this. And they kind of just told everyone, like, don't follow this. This really sucks. So with this act, the idea of the non-importation agreements came about, which basically said, we're going to try and not take British things. We're not going to import British items. So this was really useful because a lot of important cities that had ports were involved in this, such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. So this was basically just a boycott of British goods, and it started the American homespun movement. The Daughters of Liberty, which was kind of like the female version of the Sons of Liberty, just they weren't as mean as the Sons of Liberty. They helped out in this movement a lot. This is an example of how women were involved in the American Revolution. So in 1770, the Townshend Acts were repealed, except for the tea part of the act, which was they weren't very happy about that. So then the Boston Massacre occurred. This was a conflict between the colonists and the Redcoats that occurred March 5th in 1770. 5 colonists were killed. All right. One important person on the side of the Americans is Samuel Adams. He was a part of Massachusetts. He was a big player in the American Revolution. So he proposed the Committee of Correspondence in 1772. This was basically his way of saying the colonies need to be able to communicate with each other in order to show the British what we have a problem with so that they can eventually hopefully change it. So this was very helpful in forming the First Continental Congress, which I'll get to later. The meeting purpose was not to split from Britain. It was more just to show them this is our problem. So going back to that idea of virtual representation, that is what Britain used. Is each member of parliament represented every single English subject. America didn't want this. The Americans wanted direct representation. So that meant that every single legislative member represents their own constituents. So that's what America uses right now. So another act that was created was the Tea Act of 1773. The backstory of this was that the British East India Company was losing money. So because Britain had a lot of holdings within this company, they decided that they were going to try and make it so that Americans would only be able to buy British East India Company tea. So they kind of created a monopoly. Because of the Tea Act, we have the Boston Tea Party, which occurred December 16th of 1773. The response to this was the Coercive Acts. So the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, were the first acts that were punishing the colonists. So the colonists were really upset by this because it was really just the British coming in and saying, this is what you've done wrong. The Coercive Acts were passed in 1774. What happened because of this was the Boston ports were closed until the damages were paid back from the Boston Tea Party. Extraterritoriality was given to British officers who committed a crime. So if they committed a crime in America, they would be sent back to Britain to have a trial there. It reduced the colonial government power. It continued to let the troops get quartered in America. And yeah, just going back to that, it was the first time that Britain actually punished the Americans. So the First Continental Congress was created as a direct effect from the Intolerable Acts. So they met in Philadelphia. All of the colonies were there except for Georgia. They sent a list of grievances to the king, and they wanted to basically they were just saying, we want to repeal all the acts that you've created since the French and Indian War, and we want to go back to salutary neglect. Most of the people here, though, did not want independence. They were just basically saying, give us what we were before. We don't want to separate from you. Um, but also what happened at this meeting, which would lead to Lexington and Concord, that battle, was that the people leading the meeting were saying we should create Minutemen. So basically, these were soldiers who would be ready to fight within minutes of being told, so they could prepare to fight Britain if they ended up having to fight Britain. And at this meeting, they decided they would meet again in 1 year at the Second Continental Congress. Lexington and Concord, that was the battle. Basically, Britain came in, they wanted to arrest certain leaders of the revolution within America. So they were trying to just keep it quiet. They didn't want it to be a battle, but the Minutemen were ready, and this did turn into a battle. So the Second Continental Congress met a year after the First Continental Congress. Florida was the only state who did not attend. June 15th of 1775, George Washington was named as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army because they all knew that the American Revolution was eventually going to come. But they did want to prevent that. They wanted to give Britain one last chance to kind of make up for it. So they sent Britain the Olive Branch Petition, and this was an appeal to the king to stop conflict. But the king refused to even read it, so obviously they knew they had to do something else. Still, at this time, most Americans did not want to split from Britain. They wanted to just return back to salutary neglect, but there was nothing they could really do. And one thing that really pushed people over the edge to go and write the Declaration of Independence was Common Sense, which was written by Thomas Paine. His main ideas were basically just that Britain's colonial policies were so inconsistent, so independence is their only choice. Thomas Paine also asked, how come a small little island that is so far from us, like Britain, is ruling a ginormous continent of North America? So America really just, they had that mission to the world that they had to declare independence. So Thomas Jefferson, along with his committee of 5, were appointed to write the Declaration of Independence. This had 3 parts. The first part is the preamble. It just was basically stating all the rights of the colonists. Then the second part, which was the largest part, was a list of 27 grievances. And then the last part was the formal Declaration of Independence, which was Richard Henry Lee's resolution. And it broke ties with England, and the US was now independent. So during the war, Britain was trying to recruit as many people as they could. They were trying to recruit the Iroquois, and they were also trying to recruit slaves, which would eventually cause a problem because they would take the slaves from the southern colonies, and then the southern colonies who were heavily neutral then would become patriot because they were taking their slaves and they didn't have anyone to work their fields if all of their slaves were leaving. So speaking of patriots, at the beginning of the war, America was cut into thirds. There was 1/3 Tory or loyalist. They really just wanted to stay with Britain. They were perfectly fine. They were mostly wealthy people. Then 1/3 was patriot. They were completely against Britain, wanted to leave immediately, just American Revolution all the way. And then the other third was just neutral. They didn't really have a side. But obviously, the neutral population decreased after all of these slaves were being set free by the British. So just a few important battles of the American Revolution. The first one we have is Bunker Hill. That occurred June 17th of 1775. This was seen as the bloodiest battle of the American Revolution. It was seen as an American victory, and it was one factor that convinced Britain to abandon Boston and then focus on New York because New York was heavily loyalist. Okay, so some battles in the Middle Colonies. Our first battle is the Battle of Long Island, which occurred in August of 1776. So this was a loss for the Americans, but it was also a victory at the same time because Washington was able to escape with his whole army, and he also was able to leave spies behind who would be able to help out in the next battle of the Middle Colonies, which was the Battle of Trenton, which occurred in December of 1776. So this was where patriots surprised and captured 1,000 British soldiers. So throughout all these wars, America was really trying to get the French to help them because they knew that they wouldn't be able to do it without the French. So the Battle of Princeton occurred in January of 1777. The Americans started to use guerrilla tactics, but this win was not enough to convince the French to come and help. But our next battle was able to convince the French. So this was the Battle of Saratoga, which happened in October of 1777. So this was the most important battle of the American Revolution. It was truly the turning point. The leader of the British Army had to surrender to the Americans, and this was able to convince the French to send their aid. So in 1778, the French declared war against the British, and then in 1779, the Spanish declared war against the British. Our next battle is Valley Forge. This was in 1777 to 1778. This was where Washington came and inoculated his troops because of the smallpox outbreak. This was one of the earliest versions of shots, it kind of developed that idea. So the British began to go south, and then in 1780, Charleston, South Carolina did fall to the British, but the British were able to be drove out of these areas through guerrilla tactics. These would be used by Francis Marone, who was also known as Swamp Fox. So Cornwallis, who was the leader of the British Army in that area, was forced to abandon his southern strategies and then fall back to Yorktown. And then the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781 was where Cornwallis surrendered. So with the end of the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris ended this conflict. This was the Treaty of Paris in 1783. There is a difference. So Britain saw the US as independent, and they were supposed to leave their frontier forts. This did not actually happen. On the American part, the Americans were supposed to return all of their property to the Loyalists, and they were supposed to pay their debt back to the British from all of those past problems, but that did not happen either. So talking about certain groups in the American Revolution, first we're going to talk about African Americans. All of these slaves were kind of seeing that the Americans were fighting for their freedom. So this was greatly contradicting because they weren't freeing the slaves, but the Americans were fighting for their freedom. Now we have women. So obviously we have them from the homespun movement. They were very involved in that. A lot of women traveled with their husbands to their camps during the American Revolution. And then also we can't forget Abigail Adams, who wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams. And her famous statement is, "Remember the ladies." It's basically just telling her husband, like, remember us as you're creating our new government. And yeah. Then after the war for the women, there was Republican motherhood. This basically was just the women, they had to teach their children the ideals of republicanism, which was what the Americans would base their government off of. So the women, therefore, needed a little bit of education. Okay, so after the American Revolution, obviously they needed to come up with a new way to control themselves. So we have the creation of early American governments. So state governments were already a thing. Each and every state had their own government and constitution. So each of these state constitutions had self-government, which was an indirect democratic system with a strong legislative branch. Separation of power, there was the executive, judicial, and legislative, and then limited government because they were scared because the king had controlled them so tyrannically. And then individual rights. The American government created the Articles of Confederation. That was the first form of actual government that the US had as a whole. This was created in 1781 by the Second Continental Congress. So this only had a legislative branch, though. They didn't want a really strong executive branch, so they only had a legislative branch. So the only national powers that the national government had under the Articles of Confederation was the right to declare war, the right to approve treaties, the right to receive and send ambassadors. They could borrow money. They could raise an army, but only through asking for troops from the states, and that they could settle disputes among the states. One of the biggest problems, though, was that the Articles of Confederation could not collect taxes. So this huge debt that was left over from the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation had no way to collect this money. Some other problems that came with the Articles of Confederation was that the states had no different powers based off of their population. They were powerless in foreign and interstate commerce. They could not enforce taxes because they didn't have an executive branch. There was no national court system because there wasn't a judicial branch. New amendments to the Articles of Confederation had to have a unanimous vote, which obviously was really difficult. And then a 9 out of 13 majority was needed in the colonies to pass laws. The really good thing is that they really kept the colonies together so that the Constitution could eventually be created. Another great thing that the Articles of Confederation did were their land ordinances. So the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787 was created, and it said that once a territory had reached 60,000 people, they could apply for statehood, and slavery was also banned in the Northwest Territory. So because the states had to tax their people very heavily because the national governments had no ability to, one rebellion that came out of this was Shays' Rebellion, which occurred August of 1786 to June of 1787. Basically, just former Revolutionary War veterans from Massachusetts were really upset. This was really significant because it really showed that the Articles of Confederation were weak, because it took a really long time for this to end, and this rebellion can be compared to another rebellion that will occur after the Constitution is created. The Annapolis Convention was held in September of 1786. These 5 states came together to discuss problems with commerce and just the problems with the Articles of Confederation in general. These states included New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia. And Alexander Hamilton at this meeting promised that they would meet in 1 year at Philadelphia. So 1 year later, they did meet at the Constitutional Convention of May of 1787 to September of 1787. 55 delegates from 12 states went to this meeting. The only state that did not attend was Rhode Island. So their goal was to fix the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want to change it, they just wanted to fix it. So the key players of this convention were Washington, who was the president of the convention, James Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution, and Edmund Randolph, who recommended the idea of 3 branches of government, which was an idea of separation of government which came from Montesquieu. A large issue was representation. So there were 2 plans. The Virginia plan, which was proposed by James Madison. Because Virginia was a large state, they wanted representation in the legislative branch to be based off of population. So James Madison proposed a bicameral legislative branch with 2 houses, and it was based off of population. Now, William Patterson, he proposed another plan. This was the New Jersey plan, and it wanted a unicameral legislative branch that was equal representation for every single state. The compromise to this representation problem was called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. This was a compromise by Roger Sherman. It stated that the legislative branch would be bicameral. The lower house is the House of Representatives, which would be based off of population. And the upper house was the Senate, where there would be 2 representatives per state, no matter what the size. Another compromise was needed. They needed to discuss what they would do about slaves in population count. So this led to the 3/5 compromise. So 1 slave would count as 3/5 of a person when they were counting for population for representation in the House of Representatives. Sovereignty was also the problem. They were trying to discuss who has the ultimate power, what are they going to do about that, because obviously they still don't want a tyrannical executive branch, but they also need to have more power than the Articles of Confederation had. So they created the Supremacy Clause, which basically said that the Constitution would be the supreme law of the land. So that would be the overall controller. But then they also created the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause, which said that Congress could make any laws that they saw were necessary and proper, and Hamilton really, really liked this law. So with the Constitution, we saw a split in the country. We had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. These were not political parties, but they were still a split. So the Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. They thought that the executive branch would have too many powers, and they didn't like that there weren't any rights that were explicitly said in the Constitution, so they really wanted the Bill of Rights. Then the Federalists supported the Constitution. They were worried about the centralized government that would be too strong, but they were more worried about a weak government. Each of these groups wrote papers. So you had the Anti-Federalist Papers and then the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So in the end, the Constitution was passed. It was ratified in 1788, and the Bill of Rights was added to it, and Washington was named president. One act that occurred under the Constitution was the Judiciary Act of 1789. This created the Supreme Court with one Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. So within the executive branch of the new Constitution, there was the cabinet. So you had the president, who was Washington, and then he had his Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of the Treasury, who was Alexander Hamilton, and then his Secretary of War, which was General Knox. And then he also had the Attorney General, who was Edmund Randolph, but he was not actually considered a part of the cabinet yet, even though he was very important in helping rule the country. So as the Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton's plan was created. Basically, he said that the government would take on all of the state debts that the states had, and he also was very supportive of the speculators, which was one of the problems that the opposing political party had. So this is our creation of the first political parties. We had the Federalist Party and then the Democratic Republican Party. So the main leaders of the Federalist Party was Hamilton. They favored a really strong central government, and this was supported mostly by the wealthy and merchants. The Federalists proposed an excise tax, which would tax on manufactured goods. So the more you made of something, the less tax you would have on it. So this was supporting the larger farmers and stuff like that, which upset the smaller farmers. And then they also imposed tariffs. So Thomas Jefferson was not very happy about these new taxes, but he did agree to these taxes after it was agreed that the capital would be moved down to Washington, D.C. This was the Compromise of 1790. Democratic Republicans, or Jeffersonians, were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They believed that farmers were the backbone of the economy. They wanted little taxes, which meant that there would be little federal government involvement, so they did want a weaker central government. Another split between the views of these political parties was the French Revolution. So the Federalists did not like the French Revolution, but the Jeffersonians greatly supported the French Revolution. One rebellion that occurred because of these excise taxes was the Whiskey Rebellion. This could be compared to Shays' Rebellion, as the Whiskey Rebellion was put down very fast, but Shays' Rebellion obviously lasted a very long time, which really proved how the Constitution had a lot more power than the Articles of Confederation had. The Native Americans under the Constitution did not have citizenship, but they were also not considered foreign nations, and they did not have any representation in the government. So in Europe, there was a conflict between France and Britain, and Washington decided to stay neutral. This was in 1793. During this time, though, Citizen Genet, who came from France, really was pushing the Americans to join the French side of the war. He wanted merchants to become privateers. So 2 treaties came out of this time. The first is Jay's Treaty, which occurred in 1795. This was a treaty with Britain, which said that the U.S. would get compensation for the damaged ships. And Britain also promised that they would leave their posts that they were still staying in from the time of the American Revolution. The next treaty we have is Pinckney's Treaty of 1796. Don't know if I said that right. This was a treaty with Spain, and it said that the U.S. had the ability to travel on the Mississippi River in New Orleans and the Americans really got most of what they wanted from this treaty. Okay, so eventually the Federalists kind of started to have a bit of a downfall. In the election of 1796, Adams became the president and Jefferson became VP. Adams was a Federalist and Jefferson obviously was a Republican. So one war that occurred in the Americas was the Quasi War. This was an undeclared naval war between the French and the US. This started with the XYZ affair. So 3 US diplomats were sent to France, and 3 French diplomats who were named XYZ demanded a bribe from the Americans. And obviously the Americans did not like that, so this started a war. One part of the downfall of the Federalists was the Alien and Sedition Acts. These occurred in 1789. The Sedition Act was created, and it said that you cannot speak out against the government. And this was basically just the Federalists trying to decrease the freedom of the Republican Party, so this was a big problem. A direct effect from the Alien and Sedition Act, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were created. Jefferson created the Kentucky and Madison created the Virginia. These basically just told the states to nullify these acts. Then now we have the Revolution of 1800. This was where Adams was versus Jefferson in the election of 1800. This was considered a revolution because it was a peaceful transition of power between political parties. Then, as a last act by the Federalist Party when they were in control, we have the Judiciary Act of 1801. This was passed by the Federalist Congress while Adams was still president. It created many new Federalist judge positions so that the Federalist Party could try and throw in as many Federalist people into the government before they were kicked out of the executive branch. Alrighty, so that was Unit 3 of APUS History. Sorry if it was long. Thanks for watching.